Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for choosing the Gradient Podcast. Now, we're back. Our election special came out. Thank you so much for supporting it. But now we're back with episode 11, and it's a big milestone for all of us. We have our first 10 episodes out, and we're, moving on to double digits.
Woot woot.
Woot woot indeed, Mr. One-Third. We have now completed the Bill of Rights of the Gradient Podcast, our first 10 episodes, which leads us into today's topic.
Today, we are going to be talking about esports, more specifically, the rise of esports. With quarantine, we have seen the esports scene increase in viewership. Most people believe in part two, the quarantine that we've had to be dealing with for these past months. So we can go ahead and open the discussion there. Other one-thirds of Gradient, what is your experience with esports?
Yes, thank you so much, one-third of Gradient. I definitely think that esports is an interesting topic, for a lot of teams, because like you said, we really did for a lot of people, it was, their first interaction and first engagement with esports, through quarantine. And for me specifically, I've definitely had an amplified, engagement and experience with esports through quarantine. I know we all, kind of do our different things, but I've personally been watching a whole lot of, the Overwatch League. And I think it's interesting for me because it's like we talked about, in the Rise of Sports episode, we see that, something that we may do, we may play basketball, we may play Overwatch, stuff like that. We get to see, other people do it at this professional level, which I think is really interesting.
I'd like to point out that the kinds of esports I tend to play are recognized as not real esports by the other two-thirds of Gradient. I tend to play more on the EA realm of things. We have like your FIFA, your Madden, your 2K. But according to our fellow Gradient podcast members, Evan and Jaden, those do not count as proper esports.
Fake esports.
I don't know. I don't know what transcript you have, but I definitely do think that, esports is esports. There's no way about it. The old.
I think they're fake esports. I'm gonna stand by that.
Yeah, like the old Pokemon online tournaments, like stuff like that. Pong 1v1s. That's technically esports, so I can't argue with that.
Well, hold on. Pokemon's an esport, 100%. I'm not. We weren't talking about Pokemon. We're talking about, your FIFAs, your Maddens, your NBA 2Ks. And here's the thing about that. You can only if you want to watch someone play Overwatch at a professional level, you can only watch Overwatch. But if you want to watch someone play basketball at a professional level, why would you watch NBA 2K?
They have professional and ranked like Madden leagues and stuff and whatnot where they have proper.
From a purely viewership standpoint, between watching actual football and watching digital Madden football, just to me at least, there seems like a pretty clear option as to which one would be more enjoyable for the viewer.
Well, you have to realize that professional football isn't on 24/7, and it's not all new and engaging games. They play each team plays one game a week for like a season in the year. And on top of that, I think we're getting a little bit off track. I think I have properly refuted Evan's claim, and we have officially established that the Gradient Podcast believes that Madden is actually more of an esport than Overwatch, period, end of statement. Let's move on.
Anyways, so, back to our discussion. I want to hear, Armand, we talked about, you like the 2K, the NBA, same thing, the NFL, stuff like that. But Evan, what is your, interactions and your experience with esports?
I've participated in one esports tournament. It was a Madden tournament a couple of years ago.
So it is an esport. Evan,
how ironic that is.
Headmaster of the claims against esports, actually participated in one on the game of Madden. I too participated in the FIFA tournament, playing as the FIFA equivalent of Juventus. I can't pronounce their name. They're Italian. They have Cristiano Ronaldo, and I got beaten very badly.
But outside of my my own participation in a tournament, I've been a longtime viewer of esports just in general. Growing up, I was very into Pokemon. Still am. Just not nearly as much as I was.
Too, yeah.
Yeah, back when I was a kid.
I had some cards.
But I definitely enjoy watching the the World Championships, the VGC World Championships. It just, I mean, because it playing Pokemon, like you learn about, fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire, all the type matchups. But then when you look at like the competitive aspect of it, there's a lot of like moves or abilities that you would deem useless as a little kid, you see in the competitive aspect are like integral to the game. I don't want to get too much into specifics, because I could be here for hours talking about how like spikes is an integral ability to the Pokemon game. But when you compare the casual game session that you would have to the high level competitiveness that you see at a World Championships, like such as like the VGC World Championships, just as like Pokemon as a case study, there's definitely a huge difference between that casual and competitive side of things. And I think that ultra competitive, ultra technical, ultra analytical side of the game is what draws, at least to me, what drew me into esports. Because
I think you bring up a great point, specifically with Pokemon, and specifically we've seen a lot of more sort of appeal to the trading card version of the game itself as well, on top of the more of the esport thing, where people actually like where the value of these cards have been skyrocketing, specifically recently, in light to a bunch of celebrities like collecting them and whatnot. And I know it's drawn appeal to a lot of teens and youth. This is primarily me and my BGS 10 Charizard are.
There's no way you have a BGS 10 Charizard.
Of course I don't have a BGS 10 Charizard.
Bro, I swear.
So, as I was saying, you all do bring up some pretty interesting points. And I think this kind of leads us to the question of why does esports actually appeal to teens in the first place? And, for me personally, and I think a lot of teens, is you both talked about, the level of play where, you may be able to do something, but to see someone do it, it's the same reason why things like sports or professionals or experts in any field appeal to us, because you get to understand it and see the way someone who is so incredibly good at it, in this case, playing an esports game does and things. And I think that can be, both interesting, but also inspiring for, teens and other people our age.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, I think esports is so popular among teens because that's what we grew up with. A lot of like the most popular esports games out there, like your League of Legends, your Overwatch, Valorant, like those ones. Those
Fortnite.
came out, Fortnite's been on the decline recently.
Does Fortnite have like credibility in the whole scheme of esports? Do people recognize Fortnite as like a respectable game?
Yes, however, it has been on a drastic decline, but we can get into that later. But like what I was saying though, when we look at like some of the most popular esport games out there, games that are very popular in the esports scene. Oh, also like your fighting games like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Smash Bros. Those are games that we played, as kids, and then when we become teenagers and we want to get more into that like competitive, real vigorous kind of gameplay, esports is the direct line to that. And like for me, right, like Smash Bros is it's an interesting place right now in the esports scene. But ever since Melee has been it's been a mainstay at fighting game tournaments and whatnot, and Smash Bros really is one of like the cornerstones of the esports scene. And being able to play Smash Bros on the Switch with my friends in my presentation period, pre-COVID, but then also be able to go home and then watch Hungry Box or like Mewtwo King completely destroy people in Melee. There's a very interesting kind of almost like dichotomy where you have, as I said before, like the casual aspect and then translating that into the competitive aspect. I think because teens, when we get into something, we really get into it. Esports is the really getting into it of gaming. So we take what we see from esports, try to adapt that into our own playing. I know Jaden can attest to this. But yeah, that as teens we really indulge ourselves in our hobbies, and esports is the natural conclusion of that.
And yeah, like you said, I think what really does make esports appeal is, it's the games, like the games that people play in esports are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Like people are playing the games at a professional level, the same games that, I can put into my Xbox right over there. Like people are playing the games that the people and fans at home are watching, which is what makes it interesting.
So as I was saying, the few esports games that I used to play a little bit when I was over summer and when I had the free time. I used to play some Smash Bros. I was never very good on it. It wasn't on the Switch, as I feel like most people play on now. It was when the 3DS was mainstream, and I was a lot younger. I also played a sufficient amount of Fortnite when that was very popularized, and it was the whole center of the esports field on Twitch and Mixer and whatnot. And I can't say for myself that I was really an avid viewer of esports, but regardless, it was intriguing, the whole aspect of like these games being played on such an elite and high level, and me being able to participate in a similar manner, obviously not to as good of skill capacity, but at least to like throw my hat and sort of be involved is something that I feel like is the big appeal in comparison to other hobbies like actual sports, where you have such defining cohorts, whether it be like high school ball or college ball or the professional league, where you can't really play on the same level as these sort of people.
And I think that really is a great comparison, between esports and conventional sports, where, with the rise of esports and, their increase in popularity, what we see in esports is it's looking more and more like, conventional sports. We see esports have, players. We see esports, they have organizations built around them. They play on stages. They play in, big stadiums and stuff like that, where, the more and more we go into the future, the more and more esports starts to feel like, something that is accepted as, a real sport.
And on top of that, I want to bring up the point that you do like, I know from my personal knowledge, I don't remember the specific players exactly, but you have I know of a couple NFL players who have dropped out of the league and who are decent in like the NFL and actually joined esports leagues and started founding teams and whatnot. And it really sort of ignites that kind of sort of growing flame that esports is establishing itself in like the entirety of like gaming.
I think one of the bigger appeals to teens that esports has is the age of the players. When you look at esports, a lot of the players are very young. Like some even some organizations they have or some like esports scenes they have a
age requirement.
An age requirement on the players. But there's some those that don't. You see people who are 15, 16, 17, like high schoolers that are playing at the upper echelons of the competitive level, and they're doing well. And I think because we see all of these teen players playing well as teens, we start to think, I could do that. If I put in the hours, I could do that. And so we watch more, we learn more from what we see, and we think about can I do this? And then eventually, some people can. And that's really, I think, what appeals a lot to teenagers is that sense of not only am I watching, I could be able to be one of those players in the near future.
Yeah,
that's really an important aspect of the esports scene.
It really is that relatability to teens. But go ahead, Armand.
I just have like a follow-up on your statement. When you talk about how sort of the accessibility to put in the amount of hours to play on the level of some of like the younger people who are avidly like well and successful in the esports industry, do you think it's more a constructive use of time for everyone who has like an appeal to esports to actually put in those hours? And can we lead this conversation into the whole stigma against playing so many games and how that's almost detrimental, I guess?
I think because we, as esports, as a career, is becoming more popular, I think esports itself will be seen more as a viable career path. Much as like being a professional, like NBA or NFL player has been. When we look at countries like South Korea that have had very established esports scenes, being like dropping out of school and becoming a professional esports player is not necessarily the most outlandish thing, at least compared to how we view it in the United States. And so I think as it becomes more popular, as esports becomes more established in our culture, like societally, yeah, I could definitely see dropping, focusing all of your time onto becoming a professional esports player, becoming more and more of a viable career path for aspiring teenagers and young adults.
Yeah, I definitely think that, the more respect that, esports organizations, just esports as a whole gets, the more, of a possibility it seems for people, to kind of go into that field of work. And I think what we've seen in the past, couple of months, couple of years is that esports has been taking off. Like we, specifically brought up the Overwatch League, and last year when they had their Overwatch League final, the teams are playing in the Wells Fargo Stadium in Philadelphia to this huge crowd. I mean, look at this. And I mean, to be a player in that situation, you're playing video games in front of thousands of people who are watching you. I think that's definitely it must be a surreal moment for those players. But I think even for the people watching at home to realize that something you're so interested, something that people may not have supported for a long time is finally getting that mainstream coverage. People are starting to say, this is interesting, this is something I like, it has that relatability aspect. I think that's a huge deal for esports.
Mm-hmm. And then, I know, like, Jaden, when it comes to esports, his go-to is the Overwatch League. But even Overwatch, which is, it's a pretty established game, comparing that to, like, the League of Legends Grand Finals, League of Legends arguably being the biggest esports game ever, as of right now, at least. Looking at, like, the Grand Finals for League of Legends, like, the entire stadium completely sold out. Like millions of people watching both in person and online, a huge prize pool. It's definitely starting to look like, as we said before, it's starting to resemble, what real sports, as we would say. And and as we talked about, the more popular and grounded it gets, the more we'll see it rise. And I almost see this kind of like this cyclical increase in as esports becomes more popular, more people will get into it, and they'll become more popular, and this almost kind of like cycle of exponential increase in popularity. And I think that's what we're going towards, where just more and more people are starting to see esports as a real kind of substantive form of entertainment. And I really think that it's going to be taking over, not necessarily replacing or taking over conventional sports, but really going head to head when it comes to viewership ratings.
I know we were to sort of recall this previous conversation on the viability of esports as like a career option almost. Well, I agree to that to a certain extent. While it is true that in years past, comparatively, esports is far more avidly able to sort of participate in a career-wise, and it compared to the sort of the origins of esports, or like the sort of the mainstream popularization, it's a lot more viable to have an established career in esports. But I don't think by any means we should encourage it, or that's a poor choice of words, but almost how where we're comparing it to professional sports leagues, even the established professional sports leagues like the NFL, the MLB, the NBA, it's not something that we sort of drop out of school to be a part of, because regardless of almost the availability and the establishment of the organization itself, it's still a difficult thing to be a part of and a difficult thing to sort of maintain your status in. And obviously, if you're gifted in gaming and it's something that you've already proven, and I think it's a lot more easier to prove if you're on Twitch and if you're on Mixer and all these other streaming platforms where you have the noticeable skill to be a part of these sort of leagues. Only in those cases I necessarily encourage it, but I don't think it's as viable of a career option as we're sort of saying it is right now.
I'm gonna have to kind of both agree and disagree with you here. I do think that if you are interested in esports, or even in a career that, revolves around gaming or something like that, I definitely think that if you're interested and, you are able to put the work into it, you should definitely go for it. Like, there should, be nothing stopping you from, getting the career that you want. But at the same time, I think it's also important to put into perspective that similar to, like Armand said, similar to conventional sports, it isn't necessarily going to be easy to, to get into these esports leagues and be recognized. But again, just because it's something is difficult, I still don't think it should stop you. I think you should try, put effort and put work into it. But a little bit of what Armand said, don't put everything on the line for this, because it's not that you can't do it, right? Because as long as you believe in yourself, you can do anything. But the same thing that they've been telling kids in PE about conventional sports is that there's a small chance that you make it into something like this, right? But if you put the work in, you can do it. But don't let yourself get carried away.
And on the point of like dropping out of school, I think when it comes to the concerns about people dropping out of school and going into esports, I think because, like, if you're like a football player, right? You're a high school football player. You have there are ways for you to balance, being a football player in high school and going to college and then the NFL, because the schools have a direct program for that activity. Most schools, as of right now at least, don't have that for esports. But however, we are seeing more collegiate esports teams. I personally, I know someone who plays for the Overwatch team at his college. So as we see more academic organizations like high schools, like colleges, invest in their own esports teams, and this concern about people dropping out of high school to join the esports scene isn't going to be really a concern anymore, because there's going to be programs that their high schools and colleges have in place, similarly to how they have in place for like conventional athletics. Those programs will be in place to support these rising stars in the esports scene.
And another thing I want to point out when we talk about the comparison between professional and even collegiate sports comparatively to esports, I think hands down, I don't want to say easier, but I feel like there's a lot more availability for esports, because in conventional sports, there's a sort of requirement beyond work ethic. Because in esports, if you put in the hours, if you put in the time and the effort to be good, you will be good. But in conventional sports, you have the whole other aspect of being fit and being like tall or be a certain weight, or things that are a lot more difficult or sort of impossible to control. Because if you have, like, hypothetically, like sort of like a 5'5" kid who's puts in hours and hours a day to be good at football or basketball, will never be as good as the completely fit, like 7-foot athletes, regardless of the time. And that's not as true for esports, because it doesn't, your actual like physique doesn't play an impact, if you're excluding thumbs, I guess.
Well, to that point, I mean, like, for conventional sports, I definitely do think, that, for things like, they look at, the way you are built as a person, when deciding to put you in conventional sports. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair to say that someone who may not be as tall or as strong as someone else doesn't have, still a fair shot to, as long as they put in the work. I think they still do have that fair shot to, do whatever conventional sports they want to do. And this, I think the same goes for esports as well, where, it is a lot of practice, but there are definitely other, factors that go into it, right? And I think as long as, for both, as long as you put in the work to do it, I think it's still possible. But I kind of want to move the conversation in a different direction here. I kind of wanted to talk about, the availability to esports. We, like Evan said, we see collegiate esports being more of a thing. High schools often have, esports clubs and stuff like that. Talk about, how you feel about, the spread of esports, but also what you kind of look forward to going in the future.
I think it's awesome that we're putting or more of an emphasis, or at least the beginnings of an emphasis, on collegiate and high school esports, because frankly, previously to this notion, we were missing a whole dynamic of athletes and talented individuals who are very good at video gaming and can build potential careers on it, or sort of, I like, again, I don't want to contradict myself to my previous point, but again, careers building around video gaming, maybe not necessarily being professional video gamers, but, or more hobbies or more availability to different talents that individuals can hone in on. And I feel like an emphasis on the availability of it in college or high school is the key step to doing so.
Yeah, personally, I'm looking forward to seeing, I would argue, inevitable rise, or continuous rise, I would say, even of the esports scene. I've, as I briefly mentioned earlier, I've been a viewer of various esports scenes since middle school, really, and so seeing it, continuously increasing popularity, continuously increasing in viewership, continuously increasing in even the amount of funding for certain esports scenes, and then also as we see even more niche and or underground scenes flourish into these much more popular games. I'm 100% looking forward to it. I really can't wait to see esports almost take on conventional sports as the premier form of entertainment. So yeah, I am 100% looking forward to it.
I agree with both of you, honestly. I think what's, most appealing and most interesting about the spread of esports is just like, we see with conventional sports where you have teams, based on divisions and locations. We see pretty similar things for esports. Like in Overwatch, you're going to have teams based on different cities, not just in the US, but, globally. Same thing for things like Call of Duty. Like there are so many appeals to be like conventional sports that esports makes. And it's not like they're, trying to idolize and be exactly like conventional sports, but I think they do a really good job of taking the things that conventional sports do well and applying it to esports. And I think just the ability to support a team that may has a logo that you like, or maybe from a city that you're from, or even a city that you like, is really promising for the future of esports.
Well, when we speak about this continuous rise of esports, in your guys' opinion, coming from me who is fairly unknowledgeable about the spread of esports and sort of the mainstream popularization, do you think that it's almost going to plateau into how it is right now and sort of stay that way in terms of just having like an Overwatch League or a League of Legends League? Or do you think it can go as far as potentially having esports in the Olympics, possibly?
I don't think an esports Olympics is necessarily the most realistic thing. But as Jim was talking about, we see esports scenes almost emulating that same kind of franchise aspect of conventional sports. He brought up the Overwatch League, which I think one of the strong suits of the Overwatch League is the franchises. How we have teams based on like we have the NYXL who are like the New York Yankees of the Overwatch League. We even have the Boston team, Boston Uprising, where the New England Patriots, or where they were they were like tweeting about their fellow Boston sports teams. So yeah, I think that kind of the that franchise aspect, it grounds, it kind of provides like a frame of reference for people getting into the esports scene, where they can compare it to conventional sports, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm from New York, I like the Yankees, the NYXL, they're the Overwatch New York team, I'm gonna root for them. It gives somebody a very simple like frame of reference. I think that really aids in the in the popularity of the esports scenes that do that. But in terms of will we see like an even comparison between conventional sports and esports? I really think so. I think if more scenes moved into that kind of like franchise, that franchise team aspect, similarly to how the Overwatch League and other Activision esports scenes have done it. Of course, if they're able to, obviously with like the fighting game community, there really isn't a team aspect; it's mostly individuals. But what if there can be? I really think that those team-based esports scenes that can have those franchise aspects, similar to conventional sports will really come to dominate just the esports scenes in general. And then I really think that will, hold a candle to conventional sports entertainment, eventually leading to similar viewership rates, at least how I see it.
So to answer your question about, the possibility of, an esports addition to the Olympics, I think, that really depends on what your definition of the Olympics is, right? I think if we're talking about, will esports be added on to the pre-existing Olympics, I'm not so sure about that. But, in terms of like a global competition between, lots of, countries and lots of different regions of the world, I think that definitely is something that's going to happen in the future, but, even now we do see stuff like that happening, and I think, again, the best example of this would be, the Overwatch League, where you're going to have teams based in North America, but you also have teams, based in Europe, you have teams based in, Asia, you have teams based in South Korea, China, you have a lot of that, a lot of regions from different places across the globe. So in essence, you have that global competition, which, is to a very high degree similar to the Olympics. Now, I think this, like Evan said, this is a really strong appeal, to have these franchises and stuff like that. So my hope, and I think definitely what we're seeing the pattern now, is esports is probably going to continue to grow to even, like Evan said, rival the likes of conventional sports, because again, I think it takes what conventional sports does well, but it's so different that it's taking what they do well, but putting onto what they already do well.
I just have a quick disagreement to Jaden and Evan's last claim, and I know they're already prepared to rebuttal me on this, though I'm going to say it anyways. I know we spoke about, although esports does have this continuous and expanding mobility, I personally don't seeing it rival the likenesses of many professional and conventional sports. Not to say that esports isn't professional, wrong choice of words, I apologize. But I hear Evan speaking about the comparison between the New York Yankees and the NYXL. That seems a little ambiguous to me. I don't see something of that sort of mobility occurring solely because of the history and legacy behind very famous teams like the New York Yankees. I just don't think, at least in the soon times, that we'll see the NYXL or other famous esports teams to build that sort of legacy and that credibility and that history that all these other sports teams have, that will give it that credibility to stand on that that hierarchy of sort of importance, I want to say, or relevance is a better use of words.
Well, to follow up, I want to first not necessarily backtrack, but Jaden, you changed my mind. Actually, on further reflection, I think an esports Olympics might actually be a feasible thing we see in the future. Just because, just off the basis of what we've seen with the Overwatch World Cup and the League of Legends, World Cup, I believe as well. I can actually see different countries having their own individual esports teams that they present to an almost esports Olympics. Which that would be pretty exciting to see as an esports fan myself. But to respond to what Armand was saying, honestly, just give it time. Esports is still a relatively new and fresh thing, especially when comparing it to conventional sports. I mean, the MLB has been going on for 80 plus years. I don't know the fine details. NFL is, what was that?
I couldn't even tell you how many years.
I mean, MLB is a very, baseball itself is a very well-established sport, and the MLB has been going on for a long time. Same with the NFL, same with the NBA. These I guess you could say conventional sport scenes are very well established. And then in the future, when we see these more established esports scenes, I can definitely see them arrival in conventional sports. I mean, even because when we look at the most well-established esports scene, that being League of Legends, their viewership definitely rivals the current conventional sports scene that we see right now. I would have to, I mean, someone can fact check me in the comments, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure the 2019 Grand Finals had a similar viewership rating to the NBA Grand Finals.
The
I'm not,
NBA Grand Finals.
I'm not sure how exactly accurate that is.
Yeah.
I might be completely off. But you know, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. You can call me dumb. I can take it. It's fine. But you know, as I was saying, when we get these more established, you know, when we have, you know, more established scenes over time, you know, give it that same that same time frame, and I can definitely see esports contending viewership rating wise with conventional physical sports.
Yeah, I still do agree with Evan here. I think his, example of the Yankees and the NYXL is a very quintessential one, where it definitely shows that, again, esports is very new, and in time, I think you could see this type of fan base, this type of support for, these local regional teams that you'll see, with the New York Yankees, right? The New York Knicks, the New York Nets, right? All New York teams, the Brooklyn Nets, yes. But I do think that, a team like the New York Excelsior, they have that same, regional appeal that conventional sports has. So in time, I think you could see, these legacies being built and the support for esports growing.
Agree to disagree. I think the time frame you're looking at is a lot longer than the continuous rise of esports seems to be in terms of viewership. But I guess we'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave the conversation, but also a great place to pick a new one up. We are so excited to bring and announce our guest for this episode to help us talk a little bit more about his experience working as a caster for the Overwatch League, but also his experience with esports in general. We're so happy to bring on Mr. Mitch Leslie.
Thank you, Jaden. I am so happy to have the honor to introduce play-by-play commentator, 3-year Overwatch League caster, and surprisingly, a man with a phobia of cotton balls, Mr. Mitch Leslie. Thank you for joining us on the Gradient Podcast.
Guys, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's the texture of cotton balls. They're too soft. They make me shiver when I touch them. I can't really explain it. Yeah, it's just one of those weird things. Glad to be here.
Yes, I'm sure there are many people who can relate to that. But to start it off with our first question, growing up, did you know that you wanted to get into esports as a career? And then, following your going into esports, what was the reaction from your parents and families and friends? And when you made this decision?
So I didn't know you could even have a job in esports growing up, right? I grew up in the countryside from like age 10 to 16 is when I went to school. So I barely had the internet, fam. We're on dial-up out there. And I knew that my computer time for the day was over when mum would come downstairs and just rip out the dial-up cable. And I'd disconnect from the game I was in. So no, I mean, I was pretty good with books and academia and not with people. So my studies went fairly well, but I was pretty nerdy, pretty sort of outcast kind of kid growing up. I went to university to study aerospace engineering, but that didn't really pan out. It turns out that actually the timing wasn't great for me. There weren't a lot of jobs that were in that field in Australia, and esports was actually something that I fell into more by luck than anything else, because I started later than a lot of other gamers, right? I didn't start playing competitive video games until I was 17 or so, because I was in the countryside, it just wasn't an option. So yeah, that was a late bloomer in that regard. And I guess a lot of things just happened in just the right way to get me to where I am now in an esports casting job.
And then, when you finally became a caster, what were the reactions from your loved ones or your family and friends?
Well, the first time it became real for me, it wasn't just like, hey mum, yeah, I'm gonna be in my bedroom a couple nights a week casting, and I'm gonna get paid, so no worries. It was actually, hey mum, in 2 weeks I'm gonna pack my bags and I'm actually going to Germany to be a caster. And she's like, you what? And I had to show her the contract to sort of prove and like that I was going to get paid the salary. Like, it wasn't a huge salary, right? It wasn't like, pro player gets signed by NRG and they're a god and they get $1 million. But it was a livable salary. And I had to definitely show her that to prove that her firstborn son leaving the country to live in Europe was legitimate at all. So it took some convincing, but I'd done a little bit of esports. I'd done some events. She'd seen proof that there was some kind of legitimacy to what I was doing before that. Well, I think it definitely came as a shock, but My parents are always supportive, and she's just like, all right, then go on, don't get yourself killed, but go have fun overseas, basically.
That's awesome. More of a lead-in from the last questions. When did you more specifically get into Overwatch, and how and when did you know you wanted to become a caster?
So they're obviously pretty separate, those two things. I have been casting now for about 9 years. 6 years of that has been as a professional. I've only spent 4, 5 of those as an Overwatch caster. So I knew I was a competitive Call of Duty 4 player, right? So we're going back a fair way now. This was a game that was being played competitively between 2007 and 2009. So a long time ago now. And I was I played Pro Mod. It was basically a community created mod that took all the really unbalanced stuff out of Call of Duty. I think the franchise could definitely use that these days because it's getting out of hand again. But I was like a bad player on a really good team, if that makes sense. They kept me around because I was quite a good shot caller and captain. But when it came to the mechanical side of the game, I was a little bit weaker. So I had to go to uni. And my parents didn't want me scrimming 40 hours a week of Call of Duty, which is what I was doing at the time. That's what it required to even be competitive at that early stage in like 09, where there was like no money on the line. But we did it because we loved it, right? So I wanted to be involved still in the scene. I loved my Call of Duty friends. I was interested in the games, the teams that would rise up. So I took a chance and I started helping a friend do radio broadcasts for these Call of Duty games. So that meant I could be involved a couple nights a week, but still be able to study at the same time. But there was no, you guys wouldn't be able to see the video, right? It was all radio casting back then because Australia's internet is still prehistoric. But back then you could barely upload sound, right? Now it's like 5 megasecond uploads. You can almost stream okay-ish out there. That's kind of how bad the infrastructure is. So radio casting as a side gig so I could stay involved. And I didn't realize for a few years that was actually something that could be a career, that society would put a value on that kind of skill set. That was before I started going to uni. So I did uni, and then I did 2 years working in like a CVS, like a pharmacy, because I couldn't find an engineering job, right? So 6 years in between me starting as a hobby and actually realizing it could be a career.
So, you said, you've been, casting for the past 9 years, but, specifically with the last 3 years you've worked with the Overwatch League, what did your daily life as a caster look like?
So there's three distinct eras actually with the Overwatch League based on the league structure, right? If you remember year 1, we were based in the Blizzard Arena in Burbank, in Los Angeles, right? So we would, be there 4 days a week. Yeah, with games, right, in the first season. So a lot of the time, myself and Mr. Rex, we used to live in the same apartment complex. So he would drive me because I don't drive in the US, or because we drive on the other side of the road, so I have to go through all the licensing stuff again. I'd get up at 8 a.m. or whatever, get in the car with Matt, we go get Starbucks, we just talk about Overwatch, we just hang out, and then we'd get to work. There'd be 4 games on that day probably. We might be casting 1 or 2 of them. So we would get into work. We first of all I'd go to my office, or our office. We had like a big room, all the casters room, which got so loud, but it was fun. And we would sit there and we'd look at the matchups of the day, the games we were casting, start to develop some storylines. We'd talk a lot with the analyst desk because they'd obviously be on in between the games, and they kind of set the tone. And we would, want to try and piggyback off the kind of stuff that they established and have a cohesive narrative. And then I'd get out there, I'd cast the games, and when my games are done, maybe I'd leave early, but more likely I'd go get some crew lunch. So I had like a catering room for everybody, and I'd go sit in the crowd and interact and hang out. So that's 4 days a week. And then usually I would say there was an extra day of prep or like self-review, or I'd be watching like the Korea games that were going on. Like I'd be watching the Apex games or what, just so I didn't get blindsided by not knowing any matchups or players that come out of nowhere. So and then so it'd be like 8 a.m. I mean, some days we'd start a little bit later. We'd get to the arena at 12, but it'd be like a 10-hour day at the arena. Fast forward to this year, it was homestands. So we would actually sort of, the 2 days before we'd fly out there, we'd have a day on site before, the game started, where we'd get there, we'd have a tech check, a rehearsal, make sure everything's working, make sure my screen in my caster booth is the right height, because obviously, like, if you're standing there for hours, like, you can get a really sore neck. Like, make sure my headset's working properly, that I'm happy. And then we talk with the producers about how the show's going to go, and maybe there's like a sponsorship thing that I have to read out, right? Maybe like IBM is sponsoring the Philadelphia homestand, and I've got to, you know, make sure that I mention IBM a bunch, or you know, or whatever. And then we you know, that'll be the day one. Then we'd have the next day, which we'd be casting. We turn up nice and early. We sat in the green room. We might go hang out in the crowd, and then cast. And we'd the day after. So like I'd cast 2 days in a row, and then we'd head home the next day normally, and then we'd recover for like the next trip. Sometimes it was the same week, or like the very next weekend. Sometimes it was every other week we got a break. Now in this setup, the home office setup, it's a little bit different, right? We have all of our meetings on Zoom and stuff like that. But my day consists of getting up, you know, in my pajama bottoms, and maybe I look like I put my casting shirt on. So, you know, I look somewhat professional when I'm working, sit at my desk like I am now, and make sure the light's working, the camera's working, make sure my connection to the server is working so that my camera and mic can get synced up. Because a new challenge with remote broadcast is to make sure that my audio is in sync with Matt's audio, is in sync with the game sounds. So I'm not calling things that happened a second ago, or I'm not ahead of the broadcast. There's like a ton of stuff that had to be done to sync all that stuff up. And then, everything outside of that, it was like streaming from home, basically. But 3 different ways it's looked since the Overwatch League's been in 3 different phases.
So you kind of talked about it, you know, briefly, but COVID, it came as a shock to many this year, and it changed the way that a lot of people live their lives. So how do you feel that esports organizations, you know, Activision, Blizzard, as well as others, have adapted to COVID, and how has that affected your work with casting, as you mentioned before?
So the most important thing that you want to try and do when you move from like an events-based setup to an online one is to try and maintain the quality of broadcast, right? You still want to have player interviews. So we had to set up a way to pipe players' audio in and have them in a Discord channel or something, so that like Zoe or Custer or Reinforce or one of our analysts could interview them after the game. We had to make sure that, you know, everyone had the same backdrop. You know, we tried to make sure the elements of the broadcast can look as polished as possible. And if you followed the hour this year, you would have seen like there were definitely technical glitches and stuff, like problems with getting it set up. Like some of the casters live in the same house. That house has bad internet. So if there's 2 casters live in a house, or if someone's streaming in that house and then someone's trying to cast, their feed just doesn't work. We use 3 different types of software to try and get it so that everybody, producers, directors, graphics people, replay people, observers, casters, managers, coaches, everybody could be at home and still kind of have the same ability to do their job as beforehand. So it took ages to just like get to the same level, I mean, as much as possible, right? And then there's you know, a whole host of other challenges, like, okay, well, how do we you know, bring the magic that we had at like our big, you know, homestand events or LAN events? Like, how do we try and emulate how awesome it feels to be in a live venue? And frankly, you can't. You actually, and maybe that's why doing those in-person events is so special, because you can't replicate that, right? But you do everything you can to make sure the broadcast is really polished and has, you know, we have behind the scenes features, and, you know, we get player interviews, and we do all this stuff because, you know, we just want to go further and further to really make sure that people isolated around the world can still feel like they can relate to their favorite players, and that they're involved, and that even though we're all sat at our desks, we're all sort of experiencing these games in this league, in this season, and all the ups and downs of it together. And to do that, you have to go a bit further in terms of, you know, churning out content and making sure that everyone is accessible and everyone feels involved. So I don't know how they did it. I'm not a tech guy, you know. I know how to put a computer together, and I know how to sit in front of a microphone and talk. But when it comes to putting on that kind of show, that was incredible work from the producers and the people higher up, and the all-nighters that they pulled to get us a show at all was something I'm pretty impressed by, I have to say.
I agree with you there. As someone who doesn't really do much on the technical aspect of this podcast, I am so appreciative of the other 2. But anyways, I'm going to go a little off script with this question, because it's something that I feel like really we haven't prepped for and brought up. But as someone who is an avid viewer of more conventional sports, there are so many instances of very historic plays and historic moments in the sport. Have you covered any of those like gigantic generational changing plays in the Overwatch League? And can you walk us through one of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably a couple that I've been lucky enough to preside over. I think probably, you know, the most obvious of those would be the moments where we crown our champions of the Overwatch League, right? So I've been lucky enough to cover the grand final of each of our seasons. In season 1, I did half of the grand final because it was split over 2 days. But I would say that it would have been our season 2 grand finals where it wasn't even a close match, really, as it really is. But when the San Francisco Shock managed to overcome the Vancouver Titans in a game that was hyped up a lot, but it didn't end up being very close. Regardless, it was still a very important moment because this San Francisco team had a really weak first season because they actually invested a lot of their money in players that weren't eligible to play until halfway through the season, young guys, right? They had to be 18. So they basically forewent a strong first season in order to have like a dynasty developed with the incredible talent they managed to pick up, young before anyone else could get them. So they beat the Vancouver Titans, who were supposed to be like the boogeymen of the league. They were like the strongest team. They were from South Korea, which is where all the best games are supposed to come from. Everyone expected them to just dominate. And they did. They honestly did. The only team that really stood up to them was San Francisco. So the story, or crafting the story through this grand final, was that you are dealing with the Vancouver Titans, who everyone expected to be the very best, and they almost were. There was an element of David and Goliath to the story. And when San Francisco finally won, it was not close. So we had to sort of, we couldn't be talking about David and Goliath anymore because Vancouver just got smashed by San Francisco. So we had to really pivot to, San Francisco, the idea that they invested. They took a season off. The first season of the Overwatch League, when all the hype was there, they just got pooed on. They were not a strong team. Their fans were very critical of them. Everyone said, why are you doing this? The players got a lot of hate. So in that moment when they lifted the trophy, trying to find the right words to encapsulate the journey that this team had actually made between starting off in the league with so much uncertainty to triumphing at the end of season 2, to find the right words, and not just all the words, the right small number of words that really captured what, they did was important. And I only had so much time. So I said, so San Francisco had won, we split the league up into stages, right? So it's like, 10 games a stage. And if you win every match in a certain stage, there's 4 stages, then we call it a golden stage. So when San Francisco won, I said, a golden state, a golden stage, and now finally a golden crown. San Francisco Shock, you're champions, right? So, I had to find something that wasn't just me waffling like I am now. I only had 1 or 2 sentences to work with, but I wanted to infuse that moment with all of the trials and tribulations that they'd faced, even if I couldn't sort of recite them word for word. So definitely a very powerful moment for me. Crowds going nuts. We're in the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia. It is packed to the rafters. Couldn't have asked for a more powerful moment than that, for sure.
Wow.
So when many people think of esports, they think of the players and not always the people behind the scenes. So what would you want people to know about these people who are arguably as important, sometimes even more important, behind the scenes working on esports?
Sure. I mean, I think as far as I'm concerned, that the players are the most important part of the show to me in terms of where the spotlight should be. Like the people behind the scenes don't want the spotlight. They want to be a part of creating those moments. But I think a lot of people definitely take for granted what a smooth broadcast can look like, especially in a transition to an online format. I tell you, I've heard producers. In fact, I live with one. My partner is a producer at the Overwatch League, and she sounds like she's casting when she's running the show. It takes a lot of effort. She has to coordinate a lot of different people that bring a lot of different elements together, right? Graphics, replay, person switching the scenes, the camera angles, all of that, like talking with the players or the people responsible for wrangling the players. Are they on stage? Are they ready to walk out? All this kind of stuff. It's almost like a concert in itself behind the actual concert, right? So I think people take a little bit of a simplified view of it sometimes. If I could impart any knowledge to them at all, I would say that it's a field full of professionals that put in a lot of extra hours and very rarely get the accolades for doing so. I get to sit out there, soak up a little bit of a spotlight here and there, but I don't work nearly as hard as these people. these people are the hardest working ones on the show for sure.
So something a bit unique to the Overwatch League is the addition of homestands, that we had in, season 1 and 2 and into season 3, but unfortunately with COVID, that obviously didn't work out.
Oh.
So, with homestands and getting to travel for the Overwatch League finals, were there any moments to you that stood out as almost surreal?
Yeah, I actually think so. I think that being in Washington was quite an experience because this was Washington was an expansion team added in the second season that honestly didn't play very well. Their team was just kind of booty cheeks. They come out the gates, had sort of middling performances. The players weren't really compelling personalities. It was really hard to get a read on what this team was. I get to the homestand this year and the place is packed with locals, people there to see the Justice play. And I'm like, this is actually wild because it was what helped me understand that like an endemic gamer, a lot of endemic gamers were like, who cares if these teams are named after places? Like, why does tying an esports brand to a location matter? It's all online anyway. Obviously, like maybe like Arman, like the traditional sports enthusiast is going to understand why that's important and why so many people get around that. But gamers didn't get it, right? So a lot of people was like, no one's going to turn up to the Justice because they're just not very good. And mate, place was packed. Everyone was there with Washington Justice t-shirts. They were still bad. They were better than they were last year, but it didn't really matter. So I think the surreal part for me was that we realized that these people care. That there's a pride. It's a video game team, but they represent their city or their state in some cases for some teams, and they're proud of that. No matter how booty they were last year, they still turn up this year and cheer them on. And that was when I kind of realized, well, wait a minute, this whole esports thing, this might have legs. People, this might actually be something that is relevant and stays relevant in the future because, man, they might be out there just hitting WASD and mouse 1, but it mattered to these people, and that's all that matters,
Yes. And personally, we've seen that a lot of esports casters tend to be former competitive players. Do you think that having that competitive knowledge assists you in casting? And what experiences have helped you improving your ability to cast?
So I don't have any competitive or professional experience as an Overwatch player. I would call myself pretty average. I can divulge that I'm a high platinum rank player. So I fall within like the 30th, the 20th percentile. So like, I'm within the top percentage, but still a big one. There's a lot of players that sort of dominate me. I get ruined by people of all ages on the regular and the ladder. So as a play-by-play commentator, the most important thing you can do is to set up your color commentator, right? Or your expert, like the Aikman to the Buck, right? So I'm Joe Buck in this scenario as a play-by-play commentator. And then my co-commentator, Matthew, who was an ex-pro player in Call of Duty, not in Overwatch, but his focus is more on the analytical, tactical side of Overwatch. He's my Aikman, right? So my job is to make sure that he has opportunities to delve deep into some of the finer points, the strategy, the tactics, the history of the game without me just going over the top of him with, idioms or, isms that don't really matter. So if you're a color commentator, I think having professional or high-level competitive experience is important, but there are plenty of NFL commentators that were players that are terrible at commentating, right? They know the game. They cannot convey anything about it because they lack technique as a broadcaster. I would rather work with a color commentator who was very solid in broadcast technique and had spent more time focusing on the mechanics of a broadcast than on the game. Now, I would still expect them to be able to hold their own in a conversation about the finer points and be an expert because they have to be my expert. My job is to set them up to say smart things, right? Or to allow them to spend time building this concept up for a viewer to explain to them, like, why in Overwatch, for example, the enemy team is using a hero that maybe is less popular, but suits a player specifically better, or why their strategy, why they're employing this strategy or doing something different. So there's tons of opportunities for that in Overwatch. There will be players, and there are players in Overwatch who have transitioned from being a player to being a commentator, and they do bring something that you can't really emulate if you weren't a pro player. So one of our color commentators, Jake, was a player for the Houston Outlaws, not a team that was ever really dominant in the grand scheme of the Overwatch League rankings, but he himself, very clever individual, and he's able to offer insight as a pro player that you can't necessarily get. He offers something distinct and unique, but it's not the be all and end all, if that makes sense. It helps set him apart, but it's not a baseline requirement, I would say, for someone to step into my commentary booth, as it were.
So, for many teams, getting to work on and even work with video games is kind of like a dream come true scenario. So, what advice would you give to teams who want to have this position in esports?
Yeah, I think that the trick is to, you have to be reasonable about the way you approach sort of gainful employment in esports, because the reality of the situation is the opportunities are fairly scarce. If you want to make it as a commentator or as a player, I mean, there has to be a lot of hard work for very little gain initially, right? There is a huge investment, and there's definitely a sense of delayed gratification about it, right? Esports is not at the point where you can just go and get a esports degree at college and then get an esports job and you're on your way. You know, for me, I was commentating esports as a hobby before I knew that it would even ever be potentially a job. So it just so happened that that was something I enjoyed, which is just as well, because I had to have that enjoyment for esports to spend the next 9 years not getting paid for commentating it and being able to stay, you know, interested and motivated enough to improve. So I would really encourage people that want to get involved in esports, first treat it as a hobby, okay? Try not to expect to be able to, you know, to make money out of it. Get a job / education or whatever. But like, there's something that I did on the side, right? I was studying engineering. Now, did I go into an engineering field? I did for 6 months. I just didn't really enjoy it. But I stopped doing that. But to be able to support myself while working these random esports gigs every now and then for like no money, I worked in a CVS for 2 to 3 years. You know what I mean? It's pretty hard at the amateur level to sustain yourself from esports. There are only a small bracket of people that can do it as managers, social media managers, coaches, players, broadcasters, producers, all that stuff. There's an element of an apprenticeship where you just better hope to have another source of income, and that you can do this as a passion project to get yourself into a position where you can legitimize it and then make it into a job. I would say the proportion of people that can jump straight into gainful employment in esports is in the vast minority. I would just caution people while encouraging them to keep fostering that passion, that love of games and competition in esports. Just look after yourself in the meantime. Otherwise you won't make it, you know, to the point where you have passion left over as a professional.
I have a quick follow-up before we go on the next one. So the previous portion of this episode, we spoke very heavily on the sustainability of a career in esports, both now and in the future, considering the progressive and continuous like expansion of its like credibility. How credible or viable do you think a career in esports is now, comparatively to your thoughts in the future of how it might be? And this is beyond just like Overwatch and like League of Legends. I'm talking like EA games as well as something that I play a little bit.
So I think that, you know, what counts as a career in esports, that definition will begin to expand. I think that as the industry grows, the revenues are already extremely good, right? The esports has outgrown Hollywood in total for quite a few years now. Yeah, in terms of total revenue. So it's not, you know, that sphere or that number of jobs that make sense and that are available in esports is definitely growing. Again, conversely, the amount of competition, the amount of people that are aware / interested in it is also growing. It's no longer so niche anymore. What we are seeing now is gaming going from less of like something that poorly behaved teenage boys did in basements to actually a legitimate way of, you know, of providing entertainment, especially during this period of time that, you know, we've been experiencing a lockdown. I believe that gaming has actually become much more mainstream as a way of being able to, you know, kill time or to enjoy oneself, you know, without being able to leave the house. Animal Crossing, by the way, completely blew up. All these people that had never touched a console before, all of a sudden, were building their little villages in Animal Crossing. You know, my partner who's never played the game before has spent hours tailoring her hedges and whatnot in this game, because there's a social aspect to it, right? And I think that's actually the one of the biggest things that will allow esports to grow is the social and lifestyle aspects of the industry. especially now we're seeing that players and teams are focusing much more on, wellness, well-being. These gamers are becoming influencers that now who are in a position where they are acting as role models, right? Contracts and salaries are becoming much more legitimized, protected by law, protected by unions, all that sort of stuff. So it's legitimate, 100%. And there are actually more and more ways to be involved in esports than there were, right? Like it's full-time editors, or like I said, social media people. That's a job that appeared out of absolutely nowhere in the last 10 years now. It's a thing. Like the person running the Wendy's Twitter account better be making absolute bank because they're geniuses. You know what I mean? Like this is not something that ever existed before him, but people are hungry to see brands engage in like an authentic way with people, right? Yeah, I want to see Wendy's and McDonald's like talking smack to each other on Twitter. Like that's funny as heck to me, So yeah, to answer it in short, it's growing more and more legitimate now. There will just be less of those outlier jobs where like this guy's making millions, like there'll be less of those jobs where, as things become a little bit more uniform and we get standardized things like standard rates, salaries, job expectations, it'll hopefully become a little bit less Wild West, and there'll be less situations where people are maybe getting taken advantage of by not reading their contracts, Fortnite players, or anything like that. So I think the opportunities will continue to grow, and I know that major TV networks, for example, are paying attention. The average baseball viewer's age is 57 years old, right? TV networks, or sort of endemic or norm, or like your regular sort of broadcast media, are failing to reach 18 to 35-year-old people, right? That is a bracket that is extremely valuable because that's us, that we just like to spend money, and we just like spending money on stuff. Like we're very valuable as a demographic, right? So how do they reach those people? Well, they found out they reach those people through YouTube, through Twitch, through video games. More and more people, I want to say our age, God, I'm not like a boomer now, but people between the ages of 18 and 25 are cutting the cable cord, mate. We're Chromecasting Twitch onto the TV or watching YouTube. That's where we are, and they're trying to find out how to reach us. Esports is a huge way in which they're realizing now that they can.
And then some final questions before we get into our very exciting lightning round. I wanted to ask about something that's a little bit more specific to the Overwatch League, and that is the as you talked about before, the similarly to with like conventional sports teams, like the franchise aspect of it, where you have teams that are rooted in New York or Los Angeles or Florida, and that kind of brings in that native aspect. For me, like living in Florida, I'm a Florida Mayhem fan because I live in Florida. They're not necessarily the best team in the world. I mean, they did pretty good this season, but that kind of that franchise aspect drew me in to that team. So do you think you could see that franchise aspect going into other esports scenes, and do you think that has a benefit to the scene itself?
I mean, it's a great question. It's also one that we're trying to answer with the Overwatch League, right? The idea of like what geolocation, right? There are so many, like, do people care if G2 Esports is related to Barcelona or not? Like we had this whole debate, right? Esports was divided because people were like, well, I don't care where Envious is based, this team, or or Sentinels, like, but I think if you're someone who's getting involved in esports, like, okay, you might not need a reason other than thinking Sinatra's a young thug to want to watch his Valorant team play, right? Or you just love his Twitter or whatever. But for those people that maybe need some convincing or need a reason, like when someone walks into a scene and there's like 40 different teams, and they're like, well, who am I supposed to support here? Like, I don't understand. Like, do I it's much easier, I think, to get people in on the ground floor and engaging with, like, and it also really helps local scenes, right? So in Florida, you know what I mean? Like, it makes it much easier than just sort of unite, like, people from Jacksonville or from Tampa or from, Miami or whatever to, get out to watch parties. It actually allows us now to take what happens at, in esports and actually translate that into physical locations, fan events, watch parties, whatever, these things with purpose, which is what allows teams to generate more revenue, because people turn up, they buy merch, they want to interact in real life. Like gaming and esports is no longer just something we do sat at our PCs, right? We crave the social aspect of all of this, of fandom, of supporting a team. And so that geolocation actually gives people points of reference in which to gather around, those shared interests. And at least in my, like, look, I guarantee you guys, if you can ask other sort of experts in esports, and they could completely disagree. They could say, this geolocation stuff is nonsense. It's unnecessary. Why do we need to try and copy other sports? But I think giving people a reason to care about something is never a bad thing. Never a bad thing, And if it's tying someone to a location, then so be it,
All right, so we can go ahead and start with our lightning round. So how this is going to go, we have a list of some very quick questions, and we just kind of want to hear, your off the cuff, off the top of your head answers. And so we're trying to get this very quick, lightning round. So first things first, who is your favorite Overwatch character to play as?
McCree, just because it feels good. The ding sound, bro, it's so good, so satisfying.
Being as your nickname is Uber, do you feel obligated to take Uber, or are you more of a Lyft kind of guy?
To be honest, I'm an Uber guy, but sometimes when I'm in the gym, I can't tell if I'm Uber or Lyft. You know what I mean? Maybe I'm Uber Lyfts.
So, Caster Chris, is it real?
No. People just want a reason to explain why their team sucks.
So you've been known for some unique color commentary while casting. Is there any specific phrase that stands out to you that you are especially proud of?
Dude, there was one where, do you remember season 1 at Dallas Fuel? Chips Hyen was their support player. Basically, like I think he got killed and then he got res, and I'm like sat there like, oh no, it's a mess. There's chips all over the floor. And then he gets resurrected. I'm like, never mind, 10-second rule, and then we just kept going with the broadcast. So I got lucky with that one. I wasn't really thinking about it.
What are your thoughts on Fortnite?
I'm just not enough of a zoomer. Like, it all happens too fast. I played Fortnite, right? I just can't build like that. These guys are cranking 90s. I can't keep up. I'm out there, like, literally just begging for some wood or stone, and they're building their Taj Mahal above me, and then they're dropping down and just people's elbowing me, dude. It's too hard, man.
So I think, what all the fans want to know is, what's your favorite part about being Australian?
The fact that people think that we fight large animals and respect us for it, even if most of us just stay inside our house and avoid the venomous spiders.
And then console or PC?
PC, man. Oh, show.
Well,
Wait, quickly before we end, are there a lot of spiders and snakes in Australia?
There actually are, but you know which one's you know as the young person which ones are the deadly ones, and you never walk into like a garden shed without a torch, right? So you can usually see them coming. Like no one's just you don't go and roll around in the undergrowth, and unlucky, I guess the redback bit me. So it's on TV. Like you learn as a kid like what stuff not to touch,
Well, Uber, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you for helping us and all teams, learn more about what you do and learn more about esports as a whole. So, before you go, is there anything you'd like to say to the people watching the Gradient podcast?
I just want to say thank you guys for having me very much, and those of you, thinking about a career in esports, I really encourage you to keep following what you're passionate about, and just be sensible about it, okay? Don't put yourself in a compromising position. Look before you leap, and make sure you're taking care of supporting yourself and the people you care about on the side.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great having you
It's
on.
a wrap.
We want to give a huge thank you to Uber for coming on and having such an informative discussion with us. And thank you so much for watching. We really had a lot of fun making this episode, and we hope you had as much fun watching it.
Before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to follow all of our socials that Evan will now repeat because I don't have them memorized.
Yes. You can follow our Instagram at Gradient Podcast, our Twitter also at Gradient Podcast, our Facebook page at Grad Pod. You can check out our website at www.itsgradient.com. That should be all of them.
As always, we'd like to continue with our tradition of the Gradient Q&A segment, and this one comes from @Charlene Sarazit on Instagram, who says, Jaden, I like your new glasses. And I first would like to say that's not a question, but thank you.
I like them too, Jaden.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think they're stellar.
You're stellar, Armand.
Actually, they're all right. I would call them stellar though.
All right, listen, you're both the worst. I don't know.
And I'm the one that gets off topic. Okay, 2/3.
And I still stand on that. But just thank you so much for watching this episode of the Gradient Podcast, the Rise of Esports, or as I like to call it, the Revenge for the Return of Sports episode. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jaden.
I'm Evan.
And I want to point out that Jaden spent 4 takes to tell that joke that was mediocre at best. I mean, I'm Armand.
Thanks for watching.
You're so mean to me.